So what we try to encourage people to think about is ways to be productive and contributive that are your choice. They are things you're choosing to engage with, but they may well still resemble some of the effort of work. And that's what makes leisure enjoyable, when it's in tension with work.
More often than not, a person's identity is tied to their job. And when they retire, well, guess what? They're lost. Instead of saying, I'm an accountant, or I'm a plumber, or I'm a digital marketing executive, or whatever they did for a living, they got nothing. Well, here to talk with us about that is Elizabeth Zelenka Parsons. She's the author of Encore, A High Achiever's Guide to Thriving in Retirement. Elizabeth, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
We appreciate you being here, and we appreciate all the help that you're about to give our listeners and viewers. But I want to start here, Elizabeth, with some, news of the day. Recently, we learned that some 1,300 people who work at the Department of Education, federal workers, will be laid off. And this sudden termination will probably leave many of them into early retirement or an unplanned retirement. And obviously, they, in addition to feeling insecure about the fact that they've just been laid off, they have to deal with loss of identity, right? They're no longer what they were. So what advice might you have for not only those 1,300, but the 130,000 federal workers who have already been laid off and then an estimated 275,000 overall who will be laid off?
Sure. No, it's a great question. And I think that we all, of course, get identified to a degree with what we do for a living, as you mentioned. But if you have no time to plan for an identity bridge, I call it, or a transition, it can be really existentially threatening because we often imagine so much of who we are as tied to what we do every day. So my best advice to people who've had this sudden sort of rupture of their identity is, first of all, to recognize they are absolutely not alone. I think many people imagine they're going through this feeling in a vacuum and they're the only people struggling with it, in part because we're all told to look forward to retirement. And we imagine it's something we should be celebrating and excited to embrace. But the truth is, there's a lot of letting go that has to happen. And so I suggest to people who've had this suddenly happen to them, first of all, just give yourself a break, but recognize, too, that there are lots of enduring parts of your identity. And there are various ways to reconnect with those, including reminding yourself what you used to love to do and who you used to love to be before you were in the career you're leaving. There's much more to it, obviously, but just recognizing that it's normal to feel a loss now is part of moving forward in a more confident way.
Yeah. So it's interesting when I think about people who have been forced into retirement sooner than they were anticipating. The statistics actually bear this out, that JP Morgan, for instance, has a study where they say, at what age do you plan to retire? And then at what age did you retire? And oftentimes they say, I plan to retire at age 65, but due to something, a layoff, a healthcare shock, or something else, it was 2 years sooner. They retired at 63. So it's not necessarily uncommon that people have a unplanned for retirement. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. So many life events can accelerate that date. As you said, sometimes health issues, family issues, just life circumstances. So people will say to me, when should I start thinking about, my life after retirement? And I say, you should always be thinking about it. It's a ongoing evolution, and thinking broadly about what you're working for and what purposes will fuel your life. Once you're done sort of trading time for money, is always a valuable exercise because we don't always know exactly what that date will be.
Yeah. So I often talk to folks who have retired, but then maybe after a year or so go back to work and maybe even in the same position that they had before. And oftentimes it's because they couldn't find a sense of purpose. So how do you find that sense of purpose in the years before you actually retire, whether it's planned for or unplanned for?
It's a great, great question. And we see that pattern as well. Sometimes people joke about failing at retirement. But what I think we all need to remember is that this word retirement is much more nuanced than we imagine, because again, of the way we're marketed to about it, we imagine it needs to be all leisure. and that what we're going to be doing and should be doing when we leave our full-time working lives is just playing full-time, and we remind people, sure, 30 Saturdays in a row sounds quite nice when you've been working for decades, but 365, that's a bit much. So what we try to encourage people to think about is ways to be productive and contributive that are your choice. They are things you're choosing to engage with, but they may well still resemble some of the effort of work. And that's what makes leisure enjoyable, when it's in tension with work. So I think the people that end up sort of boomeranging straight back into full-time jobs is because they really didn't think about the fact that they could reshape their lives so that there's some effort, some new challenge, but it's living in a nice mosaic with more time with family and friends, more time with hobbies, more time learning new things. And if you can embrace that mosaic concept, it's much easier to have a really rich, energizing chapter called retirement that isn't just playing golf and literally having fun. It's an easier way to embrace life, I think, and succeed at a chapter that feels very energizing. One of the things we talk to people about is truly thinking about a new life structure. We're all used to the monolith of work, sort of establishing the scaffolding of how we live, and then everything else gets tucked around the edges. But if you can think about reshaping it so that you are distributing your time and energy across a variety of areas you care about, it's a much more sustainable way to move into this change, just as your friend sort of proposed.
Yeah. We've also had another guest on, maybe you know him, Fritz Gilbert, who wrote the Retirement Manifesto, and he wrote a book called The Keys to a Successful Retirement. And one of the things that he said about his retirement was he said he wanted to do charitable work, but he didn't necessarily identify what it was that he was going to do in that regard. What he said was, directionally I knew where I wanted to go, but I didn't necessarily have the specifics of what I was going to do. Is that something that you encounter as well?
Absolutely. I think people can identify what I call pathways, right? You start down the pathway, doesn't mean you have to stay committed to that pathway. And in fact, bring an experimental mindset along with you and recognize that you are in a world now where everything doesn't have to work perfectly. You don't have to get it right on the first try. I mean, these are opportunities to try things, see what fits, see what clicks. And so what, right? If you try something and it isn't exactly what you were after, it's one more data point. So again, you've almost got to shape your mindset differently in this phase of life and say, it's okay to try things. And it's okay to also say, I don't actually want to do that thing I tried,
Yeah.
which is a little bit of a different mindset than we bring to work.
Yeah. So the research also shows that people who enter retirement either go back to work out of want or need. And oftentimes when they go back out of want, it's for the social interaction that they missed, that they had when they were at work. Is that something, too, that you would recommend folks who are searching for social interaction, that they find some sort of employment, whether for pay or not for pay?
Well, certainly community. Whether work is one, is certainly a pathway or a vector into it. But we talk literally about what is your relationship portfolio. It's as important or more sometimes than your financial one. And what are you going to do to energize it and to keep it diverse, interesting, growing? I mean, these are real questions you can begin addressing before you leave your working life, where you are correct in pointing out many of us get the biggest jolt of community. And if you are leaving that behind when you retire because it's just sort of unsustainable to maintain most of those relationships, it is so important to think about what are my vectors into new and growing communities. And they are there, but you have to go looking for them. And proactivity is a huge part of it. So we work with people a lot on that issue.
So, Elizabeth, much of the book seems to focus on high achievers, and I'm curious what advice you have for them as opposed to us mere mortals like me.
Right. Well, I use that phrase a little tongue in cheek, even with respect to myself as the author, because I've sort of, certainly as a younger person, was very driven to sort of get that external validation and those external success measures. And I think as a lawyer and many of the lawyers I work with, for example, we're used to these third-party indications that we're doing well, like our billable hours, the bonus we got, the accolades from a client. I think anyone, who has typically sought achievement can really struggle with this transition because we are moving into a world where all that third-party validation really goes away, and it's about whether we ourselves can measure progress in a way that makes us feel full and energized, and that we're sort of moving forward. So I remind people that you're going to need to find new measures by which to look at your progress in life and feel satisfied that you are, in fact, continuing to move forward. So, there's a lot in my book that helps people think about those issues maybe in a way they never have.
Yeah. I'm curious, what are those measures of success that replace my bonus, my partner level, my whatever, my admin? Or what
Yeah.
what are they?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So, for example, some people, I will say to them, so, if you've lived a really spectacular decade in this chapter, how will you know? Like, walk me through it because no one's going to tell you, right? No one's going to walk up
And
to your door and
there's
say,
no
hey, this
pat
has
on
been
the
a
back
great
coming,
decade.
right? Yeah.
Right. So things start to come out. So, for example, they may say, well, I would have learned new things along the way, or I've always had the goal of, learning this new language, or I would have traveled to these places that I wanted to see. I would have been able, to show up more for my young adult children as they are beginning to launch their careers. Sometimes there were relationship indicators, even in their own personal relationships that they say, you know, those things would be more robust. So it's beginning to create some definitions. They're coming from them about what a rich life means because they no longer have to check the I'm working for other people box, but it's just a different mindset to start asking yourself, how am I going to know this has been a great decade? So it's quite interesting what comes out of that.
Yeah, it's interesting when I talk to retirees who have encore careers, oftentimes what they say is, what would you do if you had the opportunity to do it again, but would have derived more satisfaction from something other than what you did as your primary career? And that often becomes their encore career, right? So it's
Without a doubt.
yeah. And it gives them great joy, right? Because they are now finally doing the things that they, would have done if they had the opportunity to do so.
Yes, exactly. And if you find yourself at a point where you are financially secure and you've got time and energy, why not try? Many people do have this unlived life and they suddenly realize, well, wait a minute, I can still go try to live it. Why not?
Yeah. Elizabeth, we're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll pick up where we left off and talk more about the book and other chapters in there. So don't go away. Welcome back to Decoding Retirement. I'm speaking with Elizabeth Zelenka Parsons. She's the author of Encore, A High Achiever's Guide to Thriving in Retirement. I'm curious, why are lawyers so hesitant to retire? I mean, maybe they should have a forced retirement age, perhaps?
Yeah,
Like pilots?
those are they're increasingly popular at big law firms, and that thus the greater need for my help. But I'll give you a few reasons. One is, as your son will probably learn if he enters practice, lawyers are excellent reactors. We know how to react to people's problems and content, which fly at us all day long, these days through our inbox. And so you get so used to this constant stream of challenging, stimulating, interesting material coming at you that you forget how to create your own experience. And so I say to people, you're going to need to move from reactor to creator. Same letters in both words, but they mean very different things. And I always see a light bulb go on. They're like, you're right. I'm so good at dealing with the things that are coming at me that I've stopped thinking about how would I compose my own day if I could? How would I decide what my week looks like? That's just not something lawyers really do. And after decades of reacting, it's actually terrifying to imagine you're going to wake up on Monday morning, open your laptop, and there's no email. It's
Right.
like,
No
what am I
email.
going to do?
Right. No email and no 8-minute block to bill. Right.
Yeah, exactly. So another, piece here is by the time folks like this are reaching their retirement age, they're absolute masters in their domain. So they're in a wonderful comfort zone where they know how to do what they do. They're among the best in their field. They've got all the answers. So it's quite comfortable, cushy. And now suddenly they've got to step out of that comfort zone into a world where maybe they want to learn something new, but it's so uncomfortable to not be the master and the expert. So I say to them, you've got to now become the student again. So if you want to learn to play the piano, for example, don't start evaluating yourself as a master pianist. You're not that yet. How about just evaluate yourself as a student of the piano and go from there? But these are all very significant shifts in what these folks are used to feeling and experiencing. Then, of course, there's the identity issue, because a profession like that creates strong identity. And, finally, life structure again. These people work hard. Most of their lives are spent thinking about or dealing with work. And when that all goes away at once, it just can feel like a huge void in the middle of the way they live if they haven't done some thinking about restructuring. So for all of those reasons, I think it's a particularly challenging transition for professionals like lawyers.
Yeah. So do you have in the book, I suspect there's a step-by-step guide for someone who is trying to rebuild their identity and purpose by chance? Yes?
Absolutely. It's broken up into very nice 4-part segments and, a good roadmap, just like a good lawyer would want. So
Right.
I've had many lawyers read it and come and say to me, I feel like you were speaking directly to me. And I've been there. I've walked through those shoes and I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of people in this moment. So I think the themes in there are pretty spot on, and hopefully the advice is a good
Yeah.
starting point.
So walk us through some of those steps, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I talk a lot. The first part of the book is about identity bridging and how to think about reconnecting with parts of yourselves that will endure beyond the career, as well as how to pull skills out of the career life and reapply them in new spaces. Those are extremely helpful ways to bridge your identity. There are some exercises in there that people can work through. Life restructuring, again, I've mentioned several times, but we've got to think about how are we going to reallocate time and energy into things like our physical health, our relationship world. How are we going to continue finding purpose and meaning, even sort of, reawaken spiritual things in life. I mean, there were all kinds of areas people have largely neglected because work has been so intense. So there are a lot of practical ideas in there about how to go about re-energizing those parts of life and what some of the benefits of those are. There were segments on getting ready. We are not financial advisors, but there are segments in that book about getting your mindset ready to become a spender instead of a saver. And then there's a whole section on getting into action. How do you really get going on your good ideas? How do you build and maintain momentum? How do you use your networks? How do you, get into research projects that will support you? So there's plenty of practical material combined with good theory on why both our experience, but even the research supports sort of these approaches.
Yeah. I mean, in writing the book, you write it from almost a personal experience point of view. You retired early and went through your identity crisis as well, and now you're helping others go through that same process. Are there some? It sounds like there's an obvious path to purpose. Are there some less obvious ways to find purpose that people should be open to?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's the entire exercise gets more fun if you can be open to the fact that you may not even know yet what's going to pop up in front of you. But get out there and start exploring. Don't be shy that you don't have all the answers. Everybody asks our clients, well, what are you going to do when you retire? It's the worst question in the world. And everybody gets it 1,000 times. And we say to people, it's okay if you don't have the answers. We often tell people, treat the first year like sabbatical. And just tell people that. I'm going to take a sabbatical and I'm going to figure it out. And then give yourself the freedom to figure it out, experiment, and try things. It's a little bit like driving at night. You can make the whole trip seeing 6 feet ahead of you. So just look for the next obvious thing or the next obvious meeting to sit down and have these conversations and explore. And I will tell you, many, many people start out exploring idea A, and in the process of that, idea B pops up, and it's suddenly the thing, And so you've got to be open to the idea that you haven't got it figured out from where you're standing today.
Right. I often think that Joe Coughlin, who was a guest on our show, has described retirement as 8,000 days, give or take. And so that's a finite period of time. So I think to myself, use those days wisely when you get there, right? Don't waste, because tomorrow there'll only be 7,999 days. So how do you help someone sort of think about like maybe compressing the need to do this, and maybe even though they're taking a sabbatical and they're taking a year to figure it out, time is finite when you get to this point in life, in a way, right?
That's fair. Absolutely fair. Well, the key to the whole thing, in my view, is enjoy the ride, right? It's going to be an adventure. And, part of the reason it's an adventure is you don't have absolutely every detail figured out yet. And in working life, we're sort of paid to get it right. We're paid to figure it out and know where we're going and why. And that's fine. But this can be like a ride on the river, and you don't have to know every detail to enjoy it. And so as the exploration is unfolding, I remind people this is an opportunity to connect with people, meet new people, learn new things, research ideas. And that process by itself is valuable. And it can be a lot of fun as long as you don't burden it with the need to be certain. That need to be certain is what robs people of the pleasure of the exploration. But again, it's a different mindset than we often need to have at work, where we are really trying to minimize the uncertainty at all times. And so I really think it's more about a mindset shift than it is about racing to an answer. And it's about enjoying the process of discovering what the answer is. So, I think that year you take off, if you will, can be really rich and interesting, especially if you can just relax into the fact that no specific answer has to emerge immediately.
Elizabeth, I'm afraid we've run out of time. I so greatly appreciate you sharing your knowledge and wisdom with viewers and our listeners, and can't wait to have you come back on a future episode.
No, thank you, Bob. This has been wonderful. I appreciate it very much.
Likewise. So that wraps up this episode of Decoding Retirement. We hope we provided you with some actionable advice to help you plan for or live in retirement.